The rain hammered against the bedroom window like bullets against glass. In the darkness, a 17-year-old boy sat motionless on his bed, staring at his reflection in the black screen of his phone. The house was silent except for the muffled voices of his parents arguing downstairs. The same argument they'd been having for months about his future, his grades, his life. But tonight was different. Tonight, something inside him had finally broken. The numbness that had been growing like a cancer in his chest had consumed everything. His dreams, his voice, his very sense of self. This is the story of David and how one night changed everything. Because sometimes, when you feel nothing at all, that's when you feel everything the most. David Martinez had always been the invisible child, not because he was forgotten, but because he had learned to disappear. In a house where perfection was the only acceptable currency, David had become bankrupt at the age of 12 when his first report card came home with a B+ instead of an A. His father, a successful corporate lawyer, had built their suburban fortress with precision and expectation. Every piece of furniture, every family photo, every achievement certificate on the wall told the same story. The Martinez family was successful, and failure was not an option. His mother, a former teacher turned full-time perfectionist, had made David's academic success her personal mission. She scheduled his life with military precision. Piano lessons on Mondays, tutoring on Tuesdays, advanced placement courses filling every available slot. She spoke of his future with the certainty of someone reading from script, Harvard, law school, partnership at his father's firm. But David had never been consulted about this script. He moved through his days like a ghost in his own life, attending classes where teachers praised his academic performance while never noticing the emptiness behind his eyes. His classmates saw him as the quiet, smart kid who always had his homework done, never realizing that he stayed up until 3 a.m, not because he loved learning, but because anything less than perfection meant facing his parents' disappointment. The numbness had started small, a disconnection during family dinners where his parents discussed his achievements as if he weren't sitting right there. It grew when he realized that his opinions were only valued when they aligned with their expectations. It consumed him completely the day he mentioned wanting to study art, and his father laughed as if he had told a joke. Now, at 17, David lived in a world of muted colors and muffled sounds. He performed the role of the perfect son with mechanical precision, but inside, he felt nothing. Every emotion had been carefully packaged and stored away, deemed inappropriate for the image his family needed to maintain. His bedroom was a museum of someone else's dreams, trophies for academic competitions he never wanted to enter, certificates for achievements that fell hollow, college brochures for schools he had never chosen. On his desk sat an acceptance letter to Harvard, the golden ticket his parents had been working toward his entire life. But David couldn't remember the last time he had felt genuinely happy about anything. If this story is resonating with you, if you've ever felt like you're living someone else's life, make sure to hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. There are millions of people out there feeling exactly what David feels, and together, we can remind each other that we're not alone in this struggle. Now, let's continue with David's story, because what happens next will change everything. The first crack in David's carefully constructed facade came on a Tuesday morning in October. He was sitting in his AP chemistry class, mechanically taking notes while his teacher droned about molecular structures, when something strange happened. For just a moment, he couldn't remember why he was there. Not just in the classroom, but anywhere. He looked around at his classmates, all furiously scribbling notes, preparing for colleges they had been told to want, pursuing careers their parents had mapped out for them. He saw their stressed faces, their hunched shoulders, their exhausted eyes. When had learning become this joyless march toward an uncertain future? That evening at dinner, his parents began their usual interrogation about his day, his grades, his college applications. But instead of his typical responses, the mechanical updates that kept the peace, David found himself asking a question that surprised even him. What if I don't want to go to Harvard? The silence that followed was deafening. His father's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. His mother's smile froze like a broken mask. Don't be ridiculous, David, his mother finally said, her voice carrying a warning. Harvard has been your dream since you were 10 years old. But David couldn't remember ever dreaming about Harvard. He could only remember being told it was his dream. "I never said it was my dream," he replied quietly. His father set down his fork with deliberate precision. "Son, we've invested 17 years in your future. We've sacrificed family vacations, weekends, our own dreams to make sure you have every opportunity. Harvard isn't just your dream, it's our family's destiny." The weight of that word, destiny, settled on David's chest like a stone. He realized that somewhere along the way, he had stopped being a person and had become a project. Every decision about his life had been made by committee, and he had never been given a vote. Over the following weeks, the pressure intensified. His parents hired additional tutors, scheduled more practice tests, filled his calendar with activities that would look good on college applications. They spoke about him in third person even when he was in the room, discussing his potential and his trajectory, as if he were a stock investment rather than their son. David began to feel like he was suffocating. Every breath felt measured, every word scrutinized, every moment of his life choreographed by people who claimed to love him but had never bothered to ask what he actually wanted. He started spending more time alone, walking through the neighborhoods near his school, observing other families through their lit windows. He saw parents laughing with their children, families playing games, teenagers who seemed comfortable in their own skin. These glimpses of normalcy felt like looking at life from behind glass. He could see it, but he couldn't touch it. The numbness began to feel less like protection and more like imprisonment. He wanted to feel something: anger, sadness, even fear would be better than this constant emptiness. But every time an emotion threatened to surface, the voice of his conditioning would whisper, "Good boys don't get angry. Smart boys don't cry. Perfect sons don't disappoint their parents." One night, he found an old sketchbook hidden in the back of his closet, filled with drawings he had made years ago before art became an impractical distraction. The pages were full of life, dragons and spaceships, portraits of his dog, abstract designs that meant nothing to anyone but everything to him. He had forgotten that he used to create things just for the joy of creating them. He tried to draw something new, but his hand felt foreign, disconnected. The numbness had spread to his creativity, his passion, his very essence. He was becoming exactly what his parents wanted: a perfect, empty vessel for their dreams. The breaking point came during a parent-teacher conference that David was required to attend. He sat in the corner of the classroom while his parents and teachers discussed his performance as if he were an absent student. They praised his grades, his test scores, his college prospects. They spoke about his bright future and his unlimited potential. But no one asked David what he thought about any of it. No one inquired about his happiness, his mental health, his dreams that didn't fit into their predetermined categories. He had become so successfully molded into their image of perfection that his own humanity had been erased in the process. That night, David looked in the mirror and barely recognized the person staring back at him. His eyes were hollow, his smile practiced, his entire presence somehow absent, even while physically there. He had achieved exactly what his parents wanted. He had become nothing so that their dreams could become everything. The explosion came on a rain-soaked Thursday evening in November, triggered by something so seemingly small that it caught everyone off guard. David had been working on his Harvard application essay, struggling to write about his passion for law, a passion he had never felt but had been told he possessed. His mother stood behind him, reading over his shoulder, making suggestions that felt more like commands. "Write about how your grandfather's immigrant story inspired your dedication to justice," she instructed. Admissions officers love personal narratives that connect to larger themes. David stared at the blank screen. His grandfather had been a kind man who worked in a factory and told jokes that made David laugh. He had never spoken about justice or law or any of the grand themes his mother wanted to fabricate. Using his memory as a stepping stone to an application felt like desecrating something sacred. "I can't write this," David said quietly. "Of course you can," his mother replied, not really listening. "Just start with how his struggles shaped your worldview." "No," David said, louder this time. "I can't write this because it's not true. None of it is true. His mother's hand froze on his shoulder. What do you mean it's not true? David slowly turned his chair to face her, and for the first time in years, she saw something flicker in his eyes. Not defiance, but desperate honesty. I don't want to be a lawyer, he said, his voice cracking slightly. I've never wanted to be a lawyer. I don't even know what I want to be because I've never been allowed to want anything. His mother's face shifted through several expressions: confusion, disbelief, anger. David, you're just nervous about the application. Once you get to Harvard, I don't want to go to Harvard. The words erupted from him with a force that surprised them both. Years of suppressed emotion poured out in that single sentence, carrying with it every ignored preference, every dismissed dream, every moment he had been told who he was supposed to be. His father appeared in the doorway, drawn by the raised voices. What's going on here? David stood up, his entire body shaking with the effort of finally speaking his truth. I'm going on. For the first time in my life, I'm actually going on instead of just going along. Son, calm down, his father said in his courtroom voice. Let's discuss this rationally. But David was beyond rational discussion. The numbness that had protected him for so long was cracking, and underneath it was a torrent of pain, frustration, and loss that had been building for years. Discuss what? David's voice was rising, every word coming from a place he had forgotten existed. How you've planned my entire life without asking me what I want. How I can't remember the last time you asked me how I feel about anything. How I've become so good at being what you want that I don't even know who I am anymore. His parents exchanged the look that parents share when their child is having what they consider an episode. A mixture of concern and strategy, trying to determine how to manage the situation back to normalcy. You're being dramatic, his mother said, using the tone she had perfected for defusing David's rare moments of emotional expression. We've given you every opportunity, every advantage. Harvard is a dream that millions of kids would kill for. It's not my dream, David shouted, and the words echoed through the house like a gunshot. It's yours. Everything is yours. My schedule, my activities, my friends, my future, it's all yours. I'm just a body you've been using to live out your fantasies. The silence that followed was different from their usual silences. This one was charged with the electricity of truth, uncomfortable and undeniable. His father stepped forward, and David could see him shifting into problem-solving mode. Son, I think you need to step back and consider what you're saying. We're your parents. Everything we've done has been for your benefit. For my benefit? David laughed, but there was no humor in it. When was the last time you asked me what would benefit me? When was the last time either you looked at me and saw a person instead of a project? This moment, when David finally found his voice, this is the moment that changes everything. If you've ever felt voiceless in your own life, if you've ever felt like you're living someone else's dream, make sure you're subscribed to this channel, because stories like David's remind us that our voices matter. Hit that subscribe button, and let's continue to see how David's moment of truth unfolds. His mother's eyes filled with tears, but David could see they were tears of frustration rather than understanding. We love you, she said. Everything we've done is because we love you. You love the idea of me, David replied, and his voice was calmer now, but somehow more devastating in its quietness. You love the version of me that gets good grades and follows the plan and never questions anything. But you don't love me because you don't even know who I am. And the worst part is, neither do I. He looked around his room, at the trophies, the certificates, the college brochures, the carefully curated evidence of a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. I've been so busy being perfect that I forgot to be real, he continued. I've been so focused on not disappointing you that I disappeared completely. And now I'm 17 years old, and I don't know what I like, what I want, what makes me happy. I'm numb to everything because feeling something might mean wanting something different from what you've planned. His parents stood there, seeing their son clearly for perhaps the first time in years. The perfect, compliant child they had carefully constructed was revealing himself to be a hollow shell, and the implications of that realization were staggering. I can't do this anymore, David said finally. I can't keep pretending to be someone I'm not just to make you proud. I need to figure out who I actually am, even if that person disappoints you. The weeks that followed David's eruption were unlike anything the Martinez family had ever experienced. The carefully maintained equilibrium of their household had been shattered, and nobody was quite sure how to rebuild it. His parents went through stages of reaction. First came denial. Surely this was just teenage rebellion that would pass. Then anger. After everything they had sacrificed, how dare he throw it all away? Then bargaining. Maybe they could compromise, find a middle ground between his dreams and theirs. But David had crossed a line from which there was no return. Having finally acknowledged the numbness that had consumed him, he couldn't go back to pretending it didn't exist. The emotions that had been suppressed for so long began to surface gradually, like feeling returning to a limb that had fallen asleep. At first, the feelings were overwhelming. Years of accumulated sadness, frustration, and longing hit him in waves. There were nights when he cried for hours, mourning not just his lost childhood, but the person he might have been if he had been allowed to grow naturally instead of being pruned into shape. But slowly, other emotions began to emerge. Curiosity about his own preferences, excitement about possibilities he had never been allowed to consider, fear about the unknown, but also hope that the unknown might be better than the predetermined. He started small. He signed up for an art class at school, despite his parents' objections that it would interfere with his real studies. The first time he held a paintbrush in years, his hands shook. But as he began to create something purely for his own satisfaction, he felt a spark of joy that he had almost forgotten was possible. His relationship with his parents became strained, but oddly more honest. Instead of the polite performances that had characterized their interactions for years, they began having actual conversations. Difficult, uncomfortable, but real. His mother struggled the most with the change. She had invested so much of her identity in being the mother of a perfect child that David's rebellion felt like a personal failure. "I don't understand," she would say repeatedly. "We gave you everything. You gave me everything except choice," David would reply. "And without choice, nothing else matters." His father, perhaps because his own relationship with his parents had been similarly controlling, began to show glimpses of understanding. During one late-night conversation, he admitted that he had never really asked David what he wanted because he had been so focused on ensuring David didn't make the same mistakes he felt he had made. "I wanted to give you security," his father said. "I thought if I could control all the variables, I could guarantee your success." "But what if your definition of success isn't the same as mine?" David asked. It was a question that neither of them was ready to answer completely, but acknowledging it was a start. David began exploring parts of himself that had been dormant for years. He discovered that he loved writing, not the structured, purposeful writing of college essays, but creative writing that served no practical purpose other than expression. He found that he was interested in psychology, in understanding how people's minds work, particularly people who felt disconnected from themselves. He also began to understand that his experience wasn't unique. Through online forums and conversations with classmates who had felt safe enough to be honest with him, he learned that many teenagers were struggling with similar feelings of numbness and disconnection. The pressure to be perfect had created a generation of young people who were successful on paper but empty inside. This realization was both comforting and terrifying. Comforting because he wasn't alone. Terrifying because it meant the problem was much bigger than just his family. As the months passed, David began to develop a new relationship with himself. Instead of asking, "What would make my parents proud?" he started asking, "What would make me feel alive?" The answers were often surprising. He discovered that he loved working with his hands. Not just art, but building things, fixing things, creating something tangible from raw materials. He found that he was naturally good with younger children, patient, and understanding in ways that his academic achievements had never reflected. Most importantly, he learned that emotions, even difficult ones, were preferable to numbness. Feeling sad was better than feeling nothing. Being disappointed was better than having no hopes to disappoint. His grades slipped slightly as he redirected his energy towards self-discovery, which caused tremendous anxiety for his parents. But David found that he was learning more about himself and the world than he ever had while pursuing perfect test scores. The Harvard acceptance letter still sat on his desk, but it no longer felt like a golden ticket. It felt like a path that led somewhere he didn't want to go, to become someone he didn't want to be. Spring arrived with unusual warmth, and David found himself sitting in the same spot where our story began, on his bed, looking out the window. But everything had changed. The numbness was gone, replaced by a complex symphony of emotions that he was still learning to conduct. Some days were harder than others. Some days he missed the simplicity of just following the script that had been written for him. But even on the hardest days, he felt alive in a way that he hadn't for years. His relationship with his parents was still evolving. They were learning to love him as he actually was, rather than as they had hoped he would be. It wasn't easy for any of them. Years of patterns don't change overnight, and there were still moments when they slipped back into old dynamics. But there were also new moments when his mother asked about his art, not because she was trying to redirect him towards something more practical, but because she was genuinely curious about what he was creating. Moments when his father shared stories about his own abandoned dreams, admitting that maybe success wasn't just about security and status. David had made his decision about college. He had declined Harvard and instead chosen a smaller school with a strong psychology program and opportunities for creative expression. His parents were disappointed, but they were learning to separate their disappointment from their love for him. "I used to think that loving you meant protecting you from making mistakes," his mother had said during one of their new, honest conversations. "I realize now that maybe I was protecting you from living." David still struggled with the aftermath of years of emotional suppression. Learning to trust his own feelings and desires was an ongoing process. But he had begun to understand something crucial. The numbness hadn't been protecting him from pain. It had been preventing him from growth. He started a blog about his experience, writing about the pressure to be perfect and the cost of emotional disconnection. The response was overwhelming. Hundreds of young people wrote to him, sharing their own stories of feeling numb, of living lives that belong to other people, of losing themselves in the pursuit of others' dreams. Through these connections, David began to see his struggle not as a personal failure, but as a symptom of a larger problem. A culture that valued achievement over authenticity, perfection over growth, success over happiness. He began volunteering with younger students who were struggling with similar pressures, helping them find their voices before they lost them completely. In teaching others to recognize their own numbness, he continued to heal from his own. The rain that had been falling the night of his breakdown had washed away more than just the dust on his window. It had washed away the artificial version of himself that he had been carrying around like armor, protecting him from feeling, but also preventing him from truly living. As David prepared for his senior year, he looked forward to college not as the fulfillment of someone else's dream, but as the beginning of his own journey of self-discovery. He had learned that the opposite of numbness wasn't happiness. It was feeling everything, the beautiful and the painful, the exciting and the terrifying. He had learned that being perfect was far less important than being real, that disappointing others was preferable to disappearing from his own life, that the voice inside him that had been silenced for so long was worth fighting for, worth listening to, worth sharing with the world. Most importantly, he had learned that he was not alone, that numbness was not his destiny, and that it was never too late to start feeling again. David's story reminds us that behind every perfect teenager might be someone struggling to find their own voice. If this story resonated with you, please let us know in the comments what city you're watching from and what song or band you'd like to see us create a story about next. Your voice matters, your story matters, and together we can remind each other that it's okay to feel everything, even when it's difficult. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories that celebrate the complexity of being human in a world that often demands perfection. Because sometimes the most courageous thing you can do is stop being numb and start being real.